This week's episode of our show has been sponsored by Grim Hollow, the dark fantasy campaign setting created by Ghostfire Gaming.
If you like classic monsters, gothic horror, and gritty adventures, then Grim Hollow might be the right setting for you. And now, available on the Ghostfire Gaming store, you can get all 3 of the Grim Hollow books. They have the campaign guide, which is a full guide to the world of Arathis and all of the horrors that are within.
There's also the player's guide that not only does it have a whole bunch of new subclasses, including 6 written by yours truly, there are also rules for transforming into a monster, so you can become a werewolf or a lich or a vampire as a player character.
If you need a ton of classic monsters to fill out your campaigns with, whether or not you're playing in the world of Grim Hollow, they also have their Monster Grimoire, which is packed with a ton of new monsters to bring to 5th edition.
The Grim Hollow setting is wonderful if you loved that double dose of dark fantasy in your D&D, and with a complete suite of books to support the world of Arathis or to use in your own dark fantasy campaign settings, there is lots to look forward to in the setting. So check out all the books which are available now in both physical format and PDF at the Ghostfire Gaming store by following the links in the description below.
And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we're going to be talking about how to use illusion magic in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Rather than diving into a specific build like the Illusionist Wizard or any of the other great classes that specialize in illusions, we want to look at illusion magic in more broad terms. So the tips and tricks that we're going to talk about for using illusion magic in this video are going to apply whether you are playing a bard, sorcerer, warlock, or wizard.
Or if you're playing any of the other subclasses or classes that might be able to nab a couple nice illusion spells as part of their subclass or other class features, such as an arcane trickster, these will be useful to you. We're going to be looking at the various categories that the illusion spells in D&D fall into because it's a very diverse school of magic with lots of applications. So we're going to be looking at a broad range of strategies and tactics that you can use with illusion spells in D&D 5e, whether you want to use them to trick and deceive your foes or even reshape reality itself. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
So when we are looking at illusion magic, we've broken this down into 5 categories. We're going to talk about some of the most common spells. There are other outliers that might be discussed, but those 5 categories are classic illusions, disguises, control, defense, and utility.
This is quite a lot to encapsulate for a single school of magic, but it's useful to think about the different spells in these ways because it helps communicate the purpose that you might use them behind. So when we're looking at the classic illusion spells, these are the illusions that, as befits the name, create an image in space of a figment or a projection or something that was not there before.
The major spells that stand out in this category are Minor Illusion, Silent Image, Major Image, and Programmed Illusion.
With all of these spells, your character has the ability to conjure up almost anything they can imagine, although the spells do have different levels and layers to their restrictions and what you can create with them. Minor Illusion, for example, only allows you to create a very small image of an immobile object, whereas you can use something like Programmed Illusion to create a very large image that responds when other creatures interact with that illusion or that behaves in a specific way according to the way that you demand it. In the middle ground between these, you have a spell like Major Image, which I would consider to be the illusion spell that everyone thinks of when they're thinking of illusions, because this one kind of does it all. You can use it to conjure up an illusory wall, you can use it to conjure up an illusory creature, you can then move that creature around and even have it talk with people or create sounds and smells in addition to the visual elements at the same time. So if I were to say what is the most must-have spell in this category, it's probably Major Image, although Minor Illusion is very powerful. Oftentimes, Minor Illusion is so powerful because it's often permitted to do more than what the spell description says it can do. So one of the things to be careful of here is make sure that you remember that there's a difference between Minor Illusion and Major Image.
We're going to be discussing that a little bit later in detail, but as we move on to the next category, this is probably my favorite category for illusions. I love using illusions as disguises. Being able to manipulate the way that you or your team members look in their physical appearance so that you can sneak into places, deceive people, and trick your way through every situation. It's a really fun tactic. Some of the standout spells in this category include Disguise Self and Seeming. Alter Self feels like it should be in this category, but it's actually transmutation, not illusion. And for the sake of it, I would also include Invisibility and Greater Invisibility, although you're not disguising yourself the way the Disguise Self spell does. Turning invisible is still a way of altering your physical presence so that you can get places easier. So it fits into the disguise category pretty well.
The other two spells that I would add into this category, which I don't often see used by players. I've used these spells as a dungeon master, but almost rarely do I see players use these because they have a long casting time, and that's Hallucinatory Terrain and Mirage Arcane. These spells kind of bridge the gap between a classic illusion and a disguise because rather than disguising an individual or a person or a creature, these two spells are disguising the environment. And the range and area of these spells is massive. Mirage Arcane can disguise a 1 mile radius and is so semi-real that it feels real to be in it. It can create actual difficult terrain that impedes creatures moving through it. While often I don't see players considering these spells, I think they're really powerful for strategic scenarios when you have to defend a location from an oncoming enemy. And I use them all the time as a dungeon master to create interesting environments that the players have to navigate around.
Now, when people think of illusions, they most often think of changing the environment or changing their appearance, but there's a lot of good illusion spells out there that can be used to benefit you in combat. And this includes some illusion spells for control. Spells like Phantasmal Force, Hypnotic Pattern, Fear, and Mental Prison are excellent spells to bring into the battlefield that can really mess with your enemies, do some great battlefield control, and in my opinion, some of these are some of my favorite spells to take in the game.
I think that they're some of the most powerful spells in the game as far as battlefield control goes, and this is one of the interesting things about the Illusionist arsenal that we'll talk about this issue a little bit more in detail as we go into the strategies for using illusion magic. But these spells are so powerful, and they're very unambiguous in their power and application. And so oftentimes, the illusionist will have a little bit of a dilemma. Do you use Hypnotic Pattern or Fear to frighten or incapacitate your enemies outright? Or do you try to get creative with Major Image? And that dichotomy, I think, between the raw power of these control illusion spells and what you can get away with Major Image is really going to depend on your dungeon master. It's also worth thinking about how you're going to protect yourself, because there are some very effective illusions that you can use in a defensive way. Now, technically, we could have also put Invisibility and Greater Invisibility here, but I would really consider this to be the defensive categories of spells like Blur, Mirror Image, as well as Mislead.
I think that Mirror Image is one of my favorite defensive illusion spells. Blur and Mislead are pretty cool, but Mirror Image is almost a must-have if you're playing an illusionist character. Creating multiples of yourself and decreasing the chance of you getting hit on the battlefield. As squishy as most spellcasters are, Mirror Image is a great way to defend yourself. If you pair that with other defensive spells like having Mage Armor or Shield, this just kind of shores up the sort of ratio chance of you actually getting hit, which is great.
And then finally, we have the very broad category of the utility spells. And interestingly enough, illusion magic has a lot of utility when it comes to communication and travel, because this school of magic has spells like Phantom Steed and Dream and Project Image, and of course Simulacrum, all of which are spells that allow you to get from point A to point B in an interesting way that doesn't involve teleportation, or communicate with other people at long distances, such as by using Dream or using Project Image. I just want to say, I've used the Dream spell to harass my player characters in their nightmares before, but I've never seen a player character use that on the BBEG before. And I just got to say, like, you could really wreak some havoc as a player character, I think, if you got creative with the dream spell and started using it on your enemies.
Our player Joe has taken Dream and has started using it to get into the minds of NPCs that he needs to chat with, and it's actually been really handy. It's
Yeah.
a very handy utility spell because you don't have to use it maliciously. Dream can also be used just to relay messages to people that are far away rather than having sending. If you don't have that available, you might know the person and be able to go into their dreams and be like, hey, what's up? I need to tell you something important. It's a great tool and great for harassing your players in a horror-themed campaign. The Night Hag has access to Dream, and I love the idea of playing the Night Hag almost like a Blair Witch,
Yeah.
who's haunting the dreams of people who are like traveling through her woods. There's so many cool ways to use these illusion spells. Now that we've talked about the core spells that we might pick as an illusionist, this is where we get into sort of our tips and tricks for using
Yeah.
illusion magic. For the most part, illusion magic has one of the most versatile but most subjective options available to you as a spellcaster. And that subjectivity can cause a lot of problems at the table if there are miscommunications between the DM's interpretation of the spells and the player who's taking them and their interpretation of the spells. So let's talk about some tips and tricks to get you started on being an illusionist.
I think the first thing is that if you are planning on loading up on illusion spells as a player character, you gotta talk to your dungeon master about their expectations and how they're planning to run illusion spells. There's a lot of different schools of thought and there's a lot of opinions on how illusion spells ought to work in play. And ultimately, we can share our opinions, but our opinion doesn't matter. The only opinion that does matter is that of your dungeon master. Within the D&D community and many dungeon masters that I played with over the years, there's a pretty wide spectrum on how different dungeon masters interpret, run, and rule their illusion spells. And most of this comes down to under what circumstances is a dungeon master going to decide that an NPC is going to investigate for the presence of illusions, and under what circumstances is a dungeon master going to decide that an NPC either does or does not fall for the illusion that is presented before that NPC. Because the dungeon master's in a little bit of a difficult situation. Unlike when you're a DM presenting illusions to the player characters, the dungeon master simultaneously knows both sides of the coin. And so they have to decide, okay, how fooled by this are the NPCs going to be?
So first of all, talk to your dungeon master if you're a player. If you're planning to pack up all of these illusion spells and really hoping to get a lot out of them, if you're running with a dungeon master who's going to investigate every single one, you may feel a little let down at the table. So it's important to both be on the same page. And also for you dungeon masters watching this, try to keep in mind the mental capacities of the NPCs that you're running. When your player is packing all of these illusion spells, obviously it means that they want to get something out of that. That's the character they want to play. So rewarding that creativity and rewarding their ideas is going to be a lot of fun for them and a lot of fun for you as well. A group of goblins is going to respond very differently to an illusion than the super intelligent wizard who's probably seen this stuff before. So being able to know when to pull the trigger on investigating the illusion because you're the super smart wizard, or when to send a group of goblins running away screaming because they have no idea what's going on, is going to really help to build fun at the table.
There is a balance to be taken with this. Monsters, NPCs, and other inhabitants of fantasy worlds live in a place where magic is real and it exists. How often do they encounter magical forces? Are they familiar with things like fairies, illusions, curses, and witches? Do they know how to recognize what a spell looks like when it's cast, or is this something that's unknown to them? The answers to these questions are going to determine how readily a monster or an NPC might suspect the presence of an illusion or just think, wow, that was actual magic. So I do think it's a little unfair if a dungeon master has every monster and every NPC behaving all the time like they're expecting illusion magic. One of the things I've never seen in all my years of playing Dungeons & Dragons is have a dungeon master have a monster inspect for illusions when the players weren't using illusions. It seems to only ever happen when there is an illusionist player character around. So I've always found that a little bit hypocritical. Why is it that the player character illusionist all of a sudden projects this aura that makes everyone in the world worried about illusions, when as soon as that player character isn't present, all of a sudden no one's worried about illusions anymore?
I really want to see now a player summon a creature and the villain NPC be like, that's just an illusion, and walk up to put his hand through it and his hand gets bitten. There's fun to be had there.
Yeah, I've never seen anyone ever respond to a wall of fire spell thinking that that's an illusion. They've always thought that's a wall of fire. So it is worth having that mindset going into it, where in general, when you have player characters dropping walls of fire and summoning monsters, I've never ever seen that happen, that the Dungeon Master plays it as, oh, this NPC suspects an illusion. But as soon as the player is like, I'm making an illusion of a wall of fire, then all of a sudden the NPCs are inspecting everything. That's where there has to be some trigger that prompts the investigation happening. And so that's how I try to run things. That's just my opinion on the matter. Again, everybody runs it differently, and ultimately your group has to have a conversation about it.
And I think that this ties into our next point, which is really important for players and DMs who are packing illusion spells, and that is to know the rules. That might seem very simple. Yeah, of course, know the rules on your spells, but read the spell very carefully and read it out loud a few times. And what's going to happen is, with spell casting in D&D, something that you need to keep in mind is that spells usually only do what the text says it does. With illusion spells, this is incredibly important because a lot of us have a tendency to read the spell, stockpile it up in our heads, and then sort of pull on the strings of what we remember the spell does and fill in gaps that the spell can't actually do. I myself, in our live stream, have used minor illusion to create a tarantula crawling on somebody. Afterwards, of course, many people in our audience were like, your minor illusion can't move. And I was like, what do you mean? Of course it can. And I read the spell. I'm like, yeah, it creates an illusion. But the spell doesn't say that it creates an illusion that moves. Whereas other spells, like Major Image, does say, it has text right in there saying that your illusion can move. So you want to be very careful with that. If your spell doesn't say it can do something, it probably shouldn't. Minor Illusion has gotten away with being a much more powerful spell than it is. It is only a cantrip. And so we should treat it as a cantrip, whereas Major Image can get away with a bit more because the text specifies that. So read the spells and then talk to your DM to make sure that you both have an understanding on how the spell's going to work.
Minor Illusion is a great spell, but it's not just a mini Major Image that is restricted to a 5-foot size. The other restrictions on it do apply, where it must be an immobile illusion of an object or a visual phenomena. And so some people have said, oh, well, let's get around that by making an illusion of a mannequin or a very realistic doll of a human. And I would, myself as a DM, I would say that's a little bit bordering on the spirit of the spell, although I have in the past allowed Kelly to make an illusion of a halfling with minor illusion. But probably that would be more appropriate. A response would be, no, that's the territory of Major Image, or maybe Silent Image, which can make something a little bit larger. It's worth noting that with Major Image in particular, the character has to use an action to make the image move, and this does allow it to have on a conversation. And I would still say that if you're concentrating on Major Image, you could create an illusion of a creature that looks like it's responding in combat in some way. But once again, I would probably also then allow that creatures interacting with it by attacking it to clue in that they're being deceived in some way. So the spell doesn't give a lot of leeway on how creatures detect that they're fighting an illusion, which is to its detriment, but that's what we're working with.
So now that you've read the rules and you've talked to your DM, now you're ready to start using illusions at the table. But how are you going to make them play well at the table? And I think my first tip for this is to use the environment. Think about the surroundings. Think about where you are and who you're trying to fool. This is really important, and I think that DMs need to also keep this in mind as well as the players. So, in essence, when you are thinking about your environment and thinking about who you're going to fool, you're going to have a better understanding of what type of things might be more believable in the situation you're in.
The best lies come wrapped around the truth, and the best illusions are ones that build on the environment and that you're using in a way to drive specific interactions. Let's say, for instance, that your party is fleeing down a passageway from an enemy that is pursuing them, and you want to create an illusion that you're going to leave behind to dissuade them from pursuing you. Well, one illusion you could create here would be the illusion of a cave-in. Now, this illusion might be very effective against some foes, perhaps a mindless beast, but not very effective against a tunneling creature that is just going to try to dig through the cave-in, or might try to interact with it in some way. And so, for example, if you're trying to trick a group of dwarves that a cave-in's just happened, you better make sure that you know your stone cutting better than those dwarves do, because they might know enough to be like, this doesn't make sense that this passage has collapsed.
Also, if you're trying to create a major image of a monster to scare a group of enemies, and you create a shambling mound, but you're in an underground cave where there's no plant life, and the creatures in there are going to be like, what's a shambling mound doing here? That makes no sense. Yeah. As opposed to if you put a roper in the cave, that suddenly they're like, oh no, a rock creature in the cave. That makes a lot of sense. So picking the right illusion for the right environment against the right people is extremely important to pulling your illusions off. And both as a player, you should keep this in mind, and as a DM, when your player is presenting the illusion, use how much they think about the environment and who they're trying to fool as a gauge for how much you're going to allow them to get away with the illusion.
One of the other effective things that you can do with illusions is creating illusions that dissuade creatures from interacting with them to investigate whether or not they're an illusion or not. This is why the aforementioned example of the cave-in is not always the best illusion to create, because oftentimes, if there has been a recent cave-in, creatures might go up to that, to touch it, to try to dig or move it, and they're immediately going to recognize the illusion. But if it's something dangerous looking, but perhaps even something that is itself something that you might naturally expect your hand to pass through, like the illusion of a thick poisonous gas, or a fire, or perhaps something that is positioned somewhere where a creature can't even approach it or get close to it to touch the illusion, but it's still going to sell that factor from a distance. These illusions can be very, very effective at dissuading pursuers or tricking other creatures.
Also, when it comes to the disguise version of illusions, you want to be careful about using disguises and how much you know about your enemies. I've learned this the hard way too many times, because my disguises always fail, because I disguise myself without any prior information about the environment I'm going into. And in our Red Hand of Doom campaign, we used seeming to disguise our entire group as a group of hobgoblins so that we could just walk into an enemy camp. Naturally, Monty is quite a smart DM, and it makes logical sense that the hobgoblins at this camp actually know each other and have codes and language for checking in when they're passing by. So when they started speaking hobgoblin to us and asked us for passwords and said they didn't recognize us and asked us why we were showing up at their camp in hobgoblin and none of us spoke hobgoblin, the whole thing fell apart very, very quickly. So if you are going to disguise yourself using disguise self, seeming, or anything of that sort, try to gain some intel first. That's probably a very important part of your mission. Don't expect your illusion to just work because you look like a hobgoblin and are walking into a hobgoblin camp. Just because I look like a human and walk into somebody else's house doesn't mean they're not going to be like, hello, fellow human. It doesn't work that way. So just be aware of those limitations.
A topic that we touched on as well is the use of illusions to create illusory creatures to frighten, intimidate, or otherwise trick other NPCs or creatures. I think probably the classic example of this is because Major Image can create something that is a 20-foot cube, you can convincingly create the illusion of an adult dragon appearing out of nowhere using the spell. But I've also seen players that have tried to use illusion spells to do a much more convincing and conventional summon. For example, summoning a celestial or a demon and trying to trick the enemies into fighting them. This is one of those cases where, once again, your interpretation of the illusion and your dungeon master's interpretation matters. And sometimes it might be better to avoid the ambiguity associated with the situation and just choose the spell that's going to work well. If you want to distract your foes or frighten your foes in combat using illusion magic, Fear and Hypnotic Pattern are already illusion spells and are very unambiguous in the ways that they work. And so in particular, if you want to frighten or scare off your foes, use the Fear spell. Because it will just work.
I also think that there's room in here for creativity, where a lot of people read the Fear spell and they say, oh, but I really wanted to summon an image of a creature that scared them. There's no reason why you can't describe your Fear spell as a dragon appearing in front of you, frightening the enemies, and then it just stays there kind of scaring them for the duration of the spell. That's a really cool way to interpret the use of the Fear spell. Hypnotic Pattern could be a swarm of insects or bats or something really cool that's swarming in the air, causing everybody to get distracted and disoriented by it. You can have a lot of fun with these spells by clever descriptions that match the way you imagine the illusions of your character coming to life.
And once again, Fear and Hypnotic Pattern are pretty unambiguous in how they incapacitate or frighten your foes, as opposed to using Major Image, which is going to be up to the DM to decide what your results were. This is also why, because all of these are third level spells, I don't think it's inappropriate for Major Image to scare away all the enemies. It's just to say that that's going to rely a lot more on your creativity and your dungeon master's interpretation of the scenario. And if you're worried about that negotiation, just use the Fear spell. In a similar token, it's often very tempting to do this example of summoning the fake monster to distract monster attacks, which the real summon spells are pretty effective and they fight back. And so because there's so many great options for bona fide summoning spells that warlocks and wizards have access to, unfortunately sorcerers and bards might not qualify in all of these cases. But it is worth considering, if you want to do that distraction play, maybe you should just use the real summon spell.
And lastly, as players, we often don't have the stats of every monster in front of us or have them memorized, but just be aware that there are monsters out there that have true sight. This could be very derailing for an illusionist spellcaster who steps up to perform their great illusions to a devil with true sight, or a creature that has tremor sense, or any sort of ability to see creatures without actually using their standard vision. This can really undo illusions and make the illusionist spellcaster feel pretty useless. So if you are playing the illusionist, be sure to pack some other spells along the way. Don't go all in on only illusions and forget your damaging spells, conjurations, and other things that can be helpful when you are fighting creatures that can see right through your illusions, no problem.
This is why having banishment in your arsenal as an illusionist is so good, because many of the creatures that have true sight are susceptible to being permanently banished with banishment. It also might just be handy, of course, to take a page out of the Book of the Evokers and bring along that wall of force, so that you can have that hard control element that is going to work regardless of a creature's senses. Or even just bring that fireball spell too. All of these things can be quite helpful, and sometimes you can use them creatively with your other spells. One of the things that I like to point out for illusionists is that Major Image, when it is upcast to a 6th level spell slot, no longer requires your concentration. And this means that you can now start doing really creative things by combining Major Image with another concentration-based spell from another school of magic. And this is where you can really get the sizzle going, because you can trick your enemies into falling into another trap. For example, imagine using Major Image to disguise your wall of fire.
Perhaps you can even take a wall of force and create an illusion of a box around it, which now stops the visibility so they can't teleport out of the wall of force.
Because a lot of teleportation-based effects require line of sight, and an illusion blocks line of sight until it's discovered as unreal. And so if the illusion's on the outside of the wall of force, that means that they can't investigate the illusion to prove that it's not real. Or you could take that wall of force example further. Imagine creating the illusion of a bridge and then making the wall of force, and your party crosses the bridge, and then you dispel or end your wall of force.
But the bridge is still there.
But the bridge is still there.
I was actually just going to say this as an example, that even without using concentration spells, but you just dialed this example up a notch. I love the idea of using illusion to create false hazards or false safety over hazards.
Yes.
Two great examples of this are the bridge over the lava pit, but there is no bridge. The bridge is an illusion, but there is actually a lava pit. Now, using the wall of force, you can run to safety, have everybody who's following you believe that you just ran over the bridge, and then they run straight into the lava. Option two, I've used this as a villain, as a DM. Having the pit of lava inside the dungeon, and you're trying to look for the secret room of the great wizard. The secret room, the door is actually in the pit of lava, and the lava is an illusion. But when the players walk up, it feels hot. There's bubbling lava there.
Yeah.
But they can actually climb right down through the lava, and it's nothing, and there's a door.
And that's great, too, because are you really going to stick your hand in the lava to test the lava? No.
One of my favorite illusions recently was I had an entire area of a dungeon that was invisible floors that were just hidden with illusions. And I had my players down on on their hands and knees, touching their way across the floor, crawling in midair across a great drop into a pool below. But it was a lot of fun to watch them scramble trying to figure out the illusion. All in all, illusions can be really fun as a DM. They can be really fun as a player, but you got to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And that way you can all start having fun bringing these illusions to life at your table. So this has been our tips and tricks to running illusions in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about some of your favorite uses of illusion magic in your games in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider becoming a patron of our channel by following the links in the description below.
And if you want to watch us fumbling around with illusions, you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we got many more guides to using all the spells of D&D 5e creatively right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.